in the fact that states and localities in many states, I think 21 states, allow airspace leasing above public roads. Under state law, there would be nothing precluding them, say, leasing a drone highway, an aerial corridor to drone operators in collaboration with the FAA.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 265. When it comes to drones, who owns the airspace? For that question, we turn to Brent Skorup, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University is the world's premier university source for market-oriented ideas, bridging the gap between academic ideas and real-world problems. The center advances knowledge about how markets work to improve people's lives by training graduate students, conducting research, and applying economics to offer solutions to society's most pressing problems. In addition to his role as Senior Research Fellow, Brent is also a member of the Texas Department of Transportation's Connected and Autonomous Vehicle Task Force. He has authored several articles for National Affairs, Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and others. He's appeared on TV and radio for news outlets like C-SPAN, NPR, CBS News, ABC News, and CNBC Asia. He recently co-authored an article in GovTech on drones and local and state property rights. And he also co-produced a report card on which states are prepared for the drone industry. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Brent talks about these publications, how local and state property rights laws could affect where drones fly, and why state and local governments should become more involved in the air management discussion to be better prepared for the future. But before we hear from Brent, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. So let's find out how local and state property rights laws will affect the drone industry with Brent Skorup of the Mercatus Center. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Brent to introduce himself.
I'm Brent Skorup. I'm a Senior Research Fellow and an attorney at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And my background is in telecom law and policy and technology, and increasingly I'm doing a fair amount of aviation, particularly drones and eVTOL work.
Brent, tell us about the Mercatus Center. What is it and what's its mission?
Yeah, Mercatus Center, it's an academic research center at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. And we work closely with the econ department at GMU, although there are a few lawyers like me at the research center. And we have, I think, about 25 full-time scholars working in various areas of mostly regulation, the economics and policy of regulation for areas like healthcare and public finance and technology. And we put out white papers and law journal articles and econ papers, as well as op-eds and reports and more for a mass audience.
How did you become interested in drones?
As I said, I did a lot of work in telecom for years. And what I've done, I mean, you see a lot of telecom attorneys moving into, and practice groups moving into drone law. I'm not entirely sure why that is. There's some intersection. Drones use Wi-Fi and LTE and other telecom services. But I became interested. I see a lot of potential for this industry. And at the Mercatus Center and in my team, which was the tech policy program, we have a lot of freedom to pick the projects and the areas that we think will be making a splash. And drone policy is one of those. It's an emerging area, and I saw it as a place where not only am I interested, but there aren't many people in the research world working in this area.
In a recent article that appeared in Government Technology that you co-wrote with Connor Holland, You encouraged local and state governments to get more involved in managing the unmanned vehicle airspace in their jurisdictions. Can you expand upon that?
This has been in the background for a while, and there's been a few legal scholars exploring this. I came to this for a couple years. I've been on the FCC. They have a Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, and I'm on the advisory committee and seeing some of the telecom policies, which I think there are many analogs to this world of drones, where you have federal regulation, doing certification, whether it's telecom devices or here drones, and then you have kind of on the ground work where, say, 5G or cell sites, or these other things where you need state and local help in getting these set up, because states have police powers. They can regulate the time, place, and manner of things. And so a lot of this interest in drones, I just see a lot of analogs with telecom. And to have a functioning sector, you need federal agencies and state and local authorities moving together in the same direction. And I'm worried with drones, we haven't seen as much of that. And some of that's just interest at the state and federal level or state and local level. And state and local, I mean, a lot of folks, as you know, are overstretched as it is, and this would be a big new area. So I think that's part of it. But I foresee issues of when we have mass drone services of state and local conflict. And what my research tries to do is get ahead of that, anticipate some of the issues, and get states and localities thinking about drones in a rigorous way.
The article that you wrote is called, "When It Comes to Drones, Who Owns the Backyard Airspace?" And that's really what we're talking about, right?
You hear this, and I've heard this from FAA officials and drone operators and others about, because of drones, FAA now controls all the way down to the grass tips, is this phrase. And I'm not so sure you can find that in the law. And actually, I think the law, the court decisions we have tend to go the other way, which is at low altitudes, you run into issues of property rights. And then the courts are pretty clear about this. And most of these cases are from decades ago. And I'll say a little bit about the breakdown for your listeners. Congress has delegated navigable airspace to the FAA. And navigable airspace for decades meant, where general aviation, commercial airlines, people flying hundreds or thousands, tens of thousands of feet in the air. And the argument today is that drones now extend navigable airspace into all our backyards and everywhere above, into farm fields and above the grass tips. I think that's a stretch of constitutional theory and of what Congress intended. There hasn't been, I should say, there are these cases in the past where takings cases and where property owners sue the federal government, say, because planes are flying too low, and often they win these cases. So drones, they're a little different, but courts, they look to state law, not federal law, in determining what the property interests are. For that reason, I think regulators are getting a little ahead of themselves by saying that they can put drone routes wherever as long as it's airspace.
Give us some context. We're talking about the land that is owned and controlled by someone, and that the control extends into the airspace that unmanned aerial vehicles typically fly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the nature of property rights. And just historically, we as a country and under state laws, there's a lot of protection for property owners and for property rights. There's a famous aviation case, Cosby case in 1946, where low flights over a home, so these were military flights in North Carolina, it was held to be a takings of private property. And the Supreme Court held in that case that landowners own the immediate reaches above their land. And the obvious question is, at what height is the immediate reaches? And the Supreme Court and federal courts since have not answered that question. And how airports generally get around this today is they purchase adjacent property. If they have flights that are going in at low altitude, they now purchase property or receive an easement, purchase an easement from property owners. In a world of drones, this could change. It's hard to say. I will say the closest case I'm familiar with, it was in 2016. It was a case where, and you might be familiar with it, there was some guy on YouTube hooked up a flamethrower to his drone and was flying it around his backyard. And the FAA got wind of this. This video went viral, and they wanted to investigate what was going on because it's clearly dangerous. And the court, it agreed the FAA had the ability to investigate this drone because drones are aircraft. But the court in dicta said, as an aside, it didn't buy the FAA's claim that it regulates all outdoor airspace. And according to this court, district court, cast doubt on the idea that Congress could even give the FAA that authority to regulate all outdoor airspace. So again, we don't have a clear court decision on this, but I don't want the industry and regulators at the federal and state level to get too far ahead before running into what I think will be some serious questions about what regulators can do in this area.
In your article, you raise the idea that state and local governments may have the opportunity to use their right-of-ways as a flight path for unmanned vehicles. Can you talk about that?
So this idea of drone highways or aerial corridors for drones at low altitude airspace. And I should say I didn't initiate this idea. It had been circulating in a small way. I know there was a railroad, BNSF was working with drone corridors for a few years with the FAA. There was a Utah lawmaker who proposed this. So I didn't initiate it, but I think I've done more work in this area than anyone. And we put out a report last month, talked obliquely about this idea of drone highways. And the fact that, and this might be a surprise to many people in this area, in the drone area, states and localities in many states, I think 21 states, allow airspace leasing above public roads, either local roads or state roads, and sometimes both. Historically, this has been used for real estate, say building a city or state might lease above a highway. So there could be high rises in a downtown area. But under state law, there would be nothing precluding them, a state or locality, from, say, leasing a drone highway, an aerial corridor to drone operators in collaboration with the FAA. And the reason we wrote about it and others have written about it is that you would avoid all these difficult issues about flying over private property and backyards and farm fields and so forth, where you might run into nuisance, trespass, and other complaints from landowners and takings. I mean, takings would be the big one.
What has to happen before we might see drone highways become a reality?
I mean, just showing that drones can safely fly, that there's a lot of reliability in how they can fly. And that's true whether it's over any public area, but particularly if you're flying over roads, you would need safety landing sites, throughout. If there was a malfunction for a drone someplace, it could land safely if it was losing power or something. States and localities, this would be a muscle they rarely stretch. I mean, you see some of this with, say, franchise agreements for cable companies where you're doing rights of way access and leasing, but this would obviously be an entirely new area if you're leasing airspace above public roads. And in our report, which I should say it's a drone readiness index, we rank all 50 states, but we discuss this idea of drone highway leasing above public roads. We say between 200 feet above the ground to 50 feet above the ground. So, above the treetops, but not into controlled airspace, which typically begins 500 feet above the ground.
What do state and local governments need to be aware of as this issue unfolds?
What I'm trying to do, my colleague and I, with the report we put out and with my other writings, is say, hey, to state and local authorities who might assume this is entirely a federal issue, and whatever you think of the airspace issues I mentioned, it's beyond a doubt that states and localities will be involved in takeoff and landing sites. That's going on today. States, as you probably know, are working in this area today. So I would like state and local authorities to know the state of technology, which is moving very quickly in this area. Some of the public benefits of drone delivery, it's healthcare is a big one. There are extensive medical drone delivery programs throughout the world, and including some pilot programs in the U.S., but also parcel delivery and agriculture spraying and utility inspections. And a lot of these are being used already, but the technology is quickly maturing, but our regulations, particularly on the state and federal level, have a long way to go.
What can states do to begin elevating this issue?
In our Drone Readiness Index, one of the categories we rank states on is whether they have a drone advisory committee or an aviation advisory committee. And you're seeing some of these pop up at the state level, and it's early. I wouldn't say any state has, fully formed one, but there are advisory committees at a few states. There are, say, even within the legislature, there might be a working group looking at drone issues at the state legislature. Many states have autonomous vehicle advisory committees, and it seems to me a drone advisory committee would be a great next step. So Texas last year created a connected and autonomous vehicle advisory committee. I'm a member of it, and they're looking not just at autonomous vehicles on the ground, but also at drones. And I think this is a great first step. This is early for all of us. We're in the first inning. An advisory committee, just getting commercial sector, public safety, legislator, staff, and others just at the table thinking about these issues, because, as I said, the tech is moving quickly and commercial services are being deployed at a small levels today, but it could ramp up quickly if we could modernize a lot of the state, federal, and local regulations.
What sort of feedback are you getting on the report?
It's been one of my more impactful reports, I would say. And, it was intended to be thought-provoking, but not controversial. And I want to say it's not a how-to for states and localities to do drone highways. And I think some people think that's what we're saying, and that's not it. We really are looking at how states and cities can start to prepare for this, and anything dealing with drones needs to be done in collaboration with the FAA. And yeah, the response has been, it depends where you sit. I've heard from some in the FAA who are skeptical, shall we say, of this state and local airspace leasing idea. I know there are some dissenters inside the FAA as well who think states have an interest here. On the industry side, at least it seems to break down to me. The larger operators in the industry seems to be skeptical. And what you often hear is if there's federalism with, say, drone management, there's a fragmentation problem where if you're a drone operator, you need to be in compliance with 50 states and hundreds of cities. And that's true. I think the fragmentation problem is a serious one. But I think these constitutional issues and just the practical issues, whatever the constitutional issues, states and localities will be involved in takeoff and landing and nuisance and these other issues. So on the industry side, I would say the larger operators tend to be skeptical, but many of the smaller operators have received some nice emails. They have a hard time getting federal regulators' attention, and they feel like they would have a better shot working with state and local folks.
Are there any current situations that are analogous to what you're describing for unmanned air vehicles? One
way to think about this is like traditional transportation and automobiles, where GM and Ford they're largely regulated in what they produce at the federal level, NHTSA and USDOT, but how these cars are operated are generally speaking dictated by state and local officials. Speed limits and stopping and starting and licensure. There's a lot of state and local control over how these are operated. If we take the analogy even further, you can take ATVs and dirt bikes on your private property, and you don't need to file a route plan with the USDOT. It's your private property. And I see recreational drones much like that. I think it'd be too much to ask, say, a farmer doing spraying with the drone 10 feet above his crops to file a flight plan with, say, a UTM, or it just seems excessive for what it's intended to do.
50 states, potentially 50 different sets of rules. That may be a challenge.
It is costly. The fragmentation problem, as I said, it's not minor. But because of some of these constitutional issues and just pragmatically, if you're any logistics company, You need to comply with all the local, say speed limits and licensure and these other things. There are hundreds of industries that need to comply with the laws on the ground, and drones are unique, but there are these local and state interests at play.
Setting aside the property rights issue, is there even a desire by local and state governments in becoming more involved in the unmanned airspace debate?
I want to make clear, the FAA, it's a great agency, but it's designed for a very different market. I mean, they're designed primarily to keep commercial aviation safe and efficient. And a world of drones, perhaps millions of drones daily flying in the air, the FAA is not set up for this. And if you follow the remote ID proceeding, which is expected, hopefully, to be finalized in 4 years, we'll have remote ID, and then UTM, unmanned traffic management, has to wait for remote ID to be in place before we can have extensive UTM systems. The FAA has enough on its plate for practical reasons and for constitutional reasons. States and localities need to be involved in this. And I've heard from states, they want to set up their own UTMs, and even cities want to set up their own UTMs. And whatever you think of that idea, there is interest here. North Dakota, for instance, the state legislature allocated $20 million for a statewide UTM system last year, but they're negotiating with the FAA over how that would work. We're going to see more of this, and federal lawmakers and the FAA, I hope, will formalize some of this power that states and localities have, and that they recognize implicitly. I mean, all these drone IPP projects throughout the nation, the FAA is working very closely with state and local officials, but this hasn't been formalized. And I think for widespread use, states and localities need more seats at the table.
Now, we're a long way from drones zipping through our cities. But to one of your points, it's not too early for state and local governments to begin thinking about these issues. That's
right. I want anyone to work in this area, whether it's industry or on the policy side at the federal or state level, to just have their eyes open about some of these legal issues that I think will be coming. And we're already seeing some litigation over trespass and nuisance with drones. And also states and localities that feel left out of the process. And they're a powerful interest group as well. And they have legal interests and constitutional interests. So what I hope will happen with my writing and our report is that people will have their eyes open about this, because I think a lot of these issues have been kind of dusted under the rug for the time being, but I think they'll become more relevant as you see more drone operators wanting to deploy, say, mass delivery services, parcel delivery or medical delivery, and which are good things, but the litigation, say a single nuisance case, could take down the drone industry in the entire state. And we want to get ahead of that and start thinking about it and having the regulatory systems in place to deal with that and avoid it.
I agree. As a local planner, I know the value of involving stakeholders early on, rather than after the fact and having to deal with the ramifications.
Yeah, that's right. And I should say, I came to this view somewhat reluctantly. I've said it a few times. I think the fragmentation problem is a serious one, and needing permission from counties and cities and states, it's no small matter. But there will be cities who resist what I view as very promising and life-saving technology when it comes to medical drones. But the bigger issues are the constitutional issues and the trespass issues and these other things. And I think you just need states and localities to have more authority in this area and more of a say over how this proceeds.
In addition to the GovTech article, you and Connor Halen also produced an index on drone readiness for the 50 states. It's called Which States Are Prepared for the Drone Industry, a 50-state report card. Can you tell us about it?
Underlying the report is this idea that states and localities need to have regulatory advisory bodies in place and also laws in place that bring clarity to this, really ill-defined area of law and policy, which is airspace and trespass and nuisance. So we have several factors that we look at. The first is, and probably the most notable that the people are responding to, is this idea of air rights, states and cities leasing air rights. And so we assign points to cities and states that allow leasing of aerial corridors above public roads, these airspace leases, which have been around for a few decades in many states. That's one factor. Does the state vest property rights with landowners is a factor. Another is, and drone operators tend to like this, does the state have an navigation easement, which means essentially you can fly, you're free to fly within limits so long as you don't bother people on the ground. And these laws were in place for traditional aviation because decades ago there was litigation over traditional aviation about trespass and nuisance. We look at also whether there's a drone advisory committee in the state. And finally, we score, there is a report about drone jobs in every state, and we look at drone jobs per capita and assign points that way, because it seems to get at some soft factors in the state, say a community college or university system that has drone programs, or an aerospace industry, which would position the state well for a world of drone delivery and mass drone services.
So which state ranked the highest?
North Dakota was number one, and it's nice that many of the rankings line up with kind of my gut intuition, just knowing what states are doing in this area. And in North Dakota, it is known as a leader. They're part of the federal drone pilot programs. The state, as I said, authorized $28 million for UTM last year, and none of this was scored in our report, but it just shows in another way that the state is leading in many ways.
Is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
For others who are interested in this area, there is some interest, even at the federal level, in this idea of formalizing this state control over low-altitude airspace. And there are a few bills in Congress that would draw a line in the sky at 200 feet, and below that would be delegated to state and local authorities. So there's a few bills in Congress. Senator Lee from Utah sponsored a Senate bill a few months ago, and I did a podcast with Senator Lee about drone policy and about that bill in the fall. So I would also, for listeners who are interested, they could also check out that podcast interview with Senator Lee.
And for my final question, Brent, what message would you like to leave regarding the future of the drone industry? For legal and practical reasons, states and localities need to be interested in this and need to have a say over drone operations, and more of a say than they have currently. So that's the first. I would say also the industry and regulators at the federal, state, and local level need to be aware of some of these difficult issues about air rights and issues of trespass and federalism and takings litigation. In my view, this poses a major risk for the industry nationwide. And that's one reason why I've put forward this idea of airspace leasing above public roads, which are controlled or owned by state and local governments. And then finally, for folks interested in some of these ideas, I hope they'll check out our Drone Readiness Index that the Mercatus Center published last month from me and my colleague Connor Hayland, and stay tuned for the Law Journal article that we hope to publish this summer. That's it for episode 265 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Brent Skorup of the Mercatus Center and learning about local and state property rights in the drone industry. I want to thank Brent for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Mercatus Center or want to connect with Brent, check out the website at mercatus.org. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.